So Agatha, all along, if you haven't seen my thoughts on episodes 1 and 2, surprised me. Because Agatha all along was in that bucket of shows where I just went, why are we greenlighting this show? What's the point? And look, in fairness to me and to many other people who had a similar thought, because again, if you enjoyed Echo, I'm about to talk about Echo, if you really enjoyed Echo, that's amazing. I liked Echo enough. I didn't think Echo was a disaster. I think that Echo was totally fine. But it was in that bucket of why did we have to greenlight this show when we could have dedicated resources to just combining all the resources into making it a really awesome Agatha show or a really awesome Echo show or, I don't know, a Scarlet Witch movie or something like that. I just, because it felt like part of the mandate of Disney to say we're going to just keep making Disney Plus shows. Agatha all along felt like one of those shows to me. That being said, even if that was the case, because I'm not saying that that isn't the case, it's still very possible that Jack Schaefer, the showrunner of Agatha all along and one of the head writers of WandaVision, could come out and make an amazing show. And I'm not saying that the first 2 episodes of Agatha all along are amazing, in my personal opinion. And if you think so, let me know in the comments down below. I totally respect and I love that about, if you love Agatha all along that much. I think that's amazing. I really wish I did. I really, though, got a lot of enjoyment out of episodes 1 and 2. I think that episode 1 especially was capturing a lot of the magic of WandaVision, no pun intended. And episode 2, while not as strong as episode 1 in my opinion, was really, it showed, I think, what the show could carry itself on, which is Catherine Hahn's charisma and Joe Locke's performance as well. And maybe the Witch's Road, as we were hinted at the end of episode 2. Now, if you watched my segment last week, though, you'll know I had one primary concern moving forward with the show, and that is this. So we've watched 2 episodes, I guess before watching episode 3, we had watched 2 episodes of Agatha all along, and there were 7 left, right? And the premise of the show, from everything we had heard, is that they need to go through a series of trials on the Witch's Road to get to the ultimate end, which is, I guess, regaining magic or whatever it is. So basically, the Witch's Road is a series of tests and trials that you need to go through to get to where you want to go, which is getting your magic back or whatever it might mean for different people on the Witch's Road. My concern with that premise was that every episode was just going to be, oh, look, there's another thing that went wrong, and then here we go again, and then, you start walking on the road, oh, look, another thing went wrong, here we go again, until you finally get there on episode 9. So, did episode 3 quell my fears about that premise? So, if you haven't seen Agatha all along episode 3, this is going to be a full spoiler discussion. I would recommend saving this video and coming back later, saving this segment of the podcast, saving the podcast if you haven't seen Agatha all along episode 3, because we are going to be talking about it in full spoilery detail. That is your final warning. Let's talk about episode 3 of Agatha all along. So, what I'm going to say up front, and we're going to talk about why, we're going to talk about what happened throughout the episode, but what I'm going to say up front is that I'm not going to say I did a 180 on the premise of the show, but this episode went a long way in actually convincing me that this premise might just be more viable than I thought. I'm not 100% sold, but as we talk about this more, I think you'll see that I was really beginning to change here. So let's get started. I took notes as usual, and we'll kind of go through some of the specifics that I found interesting, some things I liked, some things I didn't like, and we'll give some overall thoughts at the very end. So first thing, we start right away on the Witch's Road, and that's where we left off in episode 2, and I do quite like the aesthetic. Again, one thing that we had known from set photos and set videos is that the Witch's Road was pretty much completely practical, and I think that it shows. It's really nice. It has a very tactile quality to it, which I think is really a good thing, because a lot of the MCU is filmed on green screens and whatnot, so I think that this is a really good thing. Now, right at the beginning, one of the things, or the thing, like I mentioned, that I was worried about was the premise, right? Is this just going to be, a series of tests and then we eventually get where we need to go? And my fears were not assuaged when one of the characters said something like, there's one trial for every skill. And I went, oh boy. So we have a bunch of witches, and it's being even a little more obvious than I thought. Of every witch has a trial, and then they face their fears or whatever, and then we get over it and we move on. So again, was just a little bit, not even a little bit, very concerned about what was going on there. We continue down the Witch's Road a little bit. They're all trying to get their bearings, and then Teen this is really interesting. A lot of really interesting things happen with Teen in this episode. But Teen, like, once again, tries to reveal who he is, and it turns out it's not just Agatha who can't figure out who he is, but rather all the witches. So is it a sigil, is what they said, that was put on him, where it's only witches, which is interesting. Maybe Mrs. Hart or Sharon Davis, maybe that's why, spoiler alert, they killed her at the end of this episode, because maybe she could have heard. She was not there, I don't think, when he said his name, but she was off, being sucked into the woods by some crazy quicksand mud or whatever. But I wonder if she might have been able to tell who he was, and then maybe even she would not have been able to reveal that to the witches. But anyways, really interesting that it's not just Agatha, but rather all the rest of the witches who are unable to tell who this teen character is. So I think that that's interesting. Then we have some hijinks with Mrs. Hart or Sharon Davis. I'm even confusing them, as Agatha does the entire series thus far. Rest in peace, Sharon Davis. You will be missed. Because one thing I will say about this is that, especially in this episode, I think that early on there's a lot of exposition that's going on. Like, what is the Witch's Road, and all these trials, each trial different skill and whatnot. And I think Deborah Jo Rupp goes a long way. Her character goes a long way, and just being a kind of a persona that doesn't want to be there and has no idea what's going on and is freaking out. And I think that adds a lot of levity. It adds some good comedy in there, because I think if it was just a bunch of witches taking themselves too seriously, then I think it might not have been as interesting as if we had, a human character who was like, I don't want to be here. Like, get me out of here, which is really funny, and it leads to some hijinks, but it's also relatable. I think that there is something to be said about having a character where the audience is kind of a proxy for, seeing the world, right? And I think that that's really interesting. So anyways, they continue down the Witch's Road once they save Sharon Davis, and they see a house. And I think that, I was of two minds of this as we entered the house. I was like, oh boy, it's just going to be a trial. It's going to be a trial, and they're going to end up in the house, and they're going to escape the house, and they move on. That is what happens, but I will explain, how my thoughts were changed about this premise as we went on the episode. But there's the house, and, I like the aesthetic. I think that it still felt a little bit TV-ish, but I don't think, as I was watching the episode, I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think it felt a little TV-ish on purpose. I think that this is a television show. It's, I think Jack Schaefer intentionally created this to be like a television show, and so I don't think that's a bad thing. I also like how at the beginning it's sort of a Disney kind of aesthetic, everything's cheery and everything's happy, and you're going through the house and everything's fine. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. That's kind of fun. Now, I think the showrunner, Jack Schaefer, and the writers knew exactly what they were doing with this, as we get into huge juxtapositions later on in the episode. But we will talk about the more terrifying parts of the show in just a little bit. So then Jennifer Kale, I think, has a conversation with Teen, and we learn a little bit more. We get a little bit more lore. Look, I'm not super big on theorizing, because I just want to see what the show has in store, but I think it's interesting because, we get a mention of the fact that Agatha allegedly sold her own child, traded her own child for the Darkhold, and we get hints of that later in Agatha's hallucination. So I think that's probably true, that she traded her son Nicholas Scratch for the Darkhold, which is a crazy thing to do. And I'm sure we'll get some more backstory on that. And we get our first MCU mention of Mephisto, who I'm sure will probably make it, if there's ever a show that he's going to make an appearance in, it would be this one, even though I'm pretty sure he's going to appear in Ironheart. If that show ever comes out, I'm pretty sure he's going to appear in Ironheart. So, but if there was ever a show where he would first appear, I mean, it's here, right? I know we were all theorizing back in 2021, is Mephisto behind all this or whatever? And ever since then, it's just been a running gag that every show is, it's Mephisto is the big villain. But we actually get our first mention of Mephisto here in the MCU, and I think it's appropriate. I think that, if there ever was going to be a show that had Mephisto in it, it would probably be this one. So I think there's that. So now we get a little bit more interesting lore about Teen here, where I think Jennifer Kale says, I doubt she'd even recognize her own son, even if he showed up at her doorstep. Really interesting, because this is either the most obvious foreshadowing ever that this kid, Teen, is her son, or is somehow a part of her son, either repossessed or reanimated or something like that. Who knows? Maybe Billy Kaplan is Agatha's son, in some reincarnated form, or this is a giant red herring. I'm not sure which of the two, but I think that what is clear to me by this little conversation that happens here, is that Teen has something to do with her son. What that is, I don't know, but I think it's very abundantly clear that whoever Teen is, it had some relation to Nicholas Scratch or some relation to her son in the lore. What that is, I'm sure we'll find out later on as well. Then we get this scene where they find this wine. There's a riddle. It's kind of cute, whatever. And then they're drinking wine. And I think one of the things that's interesting that stood out to me is that they keep being paranoid about Teen not drinking the wine when they make Sharon Davis drink the wine. I'm not sure. Maybe it's just because they're still wary of Teen because they don't know who he is. And there's, they all talk about the mystery of Teen, before they get into the house. But I don't know. That's interesting. So anyways, they drink the wine. It turns out to be poison. And then they all start swelling up, which I thought was pretty creepy. I thought that was terrifying until they started to turn it into a little bit of a comedy bit. And I was like, okay, well, you had me there, because one of the things, if you had watched my predictions video, or my expectations video rather, expectations segment on the podcast a few weeks ago about what I was hoping for from Agatha all along, you'll know that I wanted a distinct tone, right? I wanted a tone that felt different from anything else that we had gotten in the MCU. And I was like, look, I'm not a horror fan at all. I think horror is probably one of my least favorite genres. But if you're gonna do something different, do horror, right? And so when their faces started to swell up, and then it started to be played off as a joke, I was like, that's lame. Like, this is just MCU 101. Like, it's just, we're taking something that could be serious or could be scary or something to that effect, and then it's turning into a joke. Although I will admit the joke where Agatha says, "I think she looks fantastic," was funny. It got a chuckle out of me, but I was a little bit disappointed because it was just kind of diving into the MCU comedy. So there is that. Then we start getting into the creepy, because now they're starting to brew this potion, which again I think is a little bit corny. Like, we have to brew a potion, we have a potion master, and whatever. I was like, okay, whatever. But then we start to get into the serious here, because then Mrs. Davis starts hallucinating about Wanda. And that's terrifying, because if you remember who this character was in WandaVision, remember episode 1 when they were having dinner and her husband was choking and she was just saying, "Stop it, oh, stop it." And that was probably one of the scariest scenes in WandaVision. Just really terrifying scene of what Wanda could do. So her having hallucinations of Wanda immediately elicited a kind of visceral reaction from me. I was like, oh my goodness, that's terrifying. I can totally imagine what she's seeing right now. And then, we have all these other characters trying to get the ingredients as they were able, as they're facing their own hallucinations. And it was at about this point when I suddenly started to realize, okay, so each episode feels very television-esque, because it feels like it's self-contained. And on the one hand, it's been entertaining thus far, although it's certainly not been the deepest bit of television I've ever seen, or it's not been my favorite episode of television ever. But on the other hand, it feels more intentionally television than filler, if that makes sense. For example, and I might get a lot of pushback from this, but a show that I think is good, I enjoy it, but I don't love it a lot like other people do, is The Mandalorian, because I think The Mandalorian has a lot of filler episodes. Whereas I think here there's delicate balance between having serialized storytelling where each episode is self-contained enough where you can watch it, but then also pay attention to a full storyline, versus filler episodes. I think, for example, The Mandalorian, because The Mandalorian for the most part it has a story arc, right, that it wants to tell, and yet it spends time with frog eggs or whatever. And I think that just didn't feel appropriate in that show, in my personal opinion. In this show, I'm beginning to realize now that this is intentionally trying to go for more of a TV vibe, in the sense that each episode is self-contained enough, right, so that you can kind of understand it, and the hijinks ensues. But we're starting to learn more about each character. And at this point, I was a little bit torn, because again, I was like, well, it was straying a little bit more into the comedy realm, and I don't know if I love that or not. But I guess we'll go with it because it was a little bit entertaining. But then here's what sold me on this episode, and here's what sells me on the premise that they're taking this thing more seriously than just an MCU quip fest. Like, it's not like She-Hulk, for example, which was it had that same premise, right? It was a very serialized show. Each episode had a distinct story that was going on there. It was trying to go for the sitcom format, but it felt like MCU-ified in the most bland sense, if that makes sense. But this show, Agatha proved to me in episode 3 that it knows that it can be something much more different, much, I'm not going to say better, but I'm going to say darker, different, and going for a different genre because it's leaning into the horror. The second that those people started to show up, it's classic horror tropes for sure. It's not like anything we haven't seen in even a horror trailer. Because I'll admit I haven't seen many horror movies, but in horror trailers, I mean, you see the girl standing in front of the door and the guy trying to drown one of the witches, and it was just creepy. I legitimately was sitting in my chair, and again, I'm someone who doesn't like horror, so the fact that I was being like, nope, this is nope, and I was just kind of not, I wasn't looking away, but I was like, oh my gosh, this is really scary. This is legitimately really scary. And the whole time I was saying, this is really scary. I hate horror. I hate this. I hate this. I hate this. But it's good. It's good. Because the reaction that it was getting out of me was something that I had not experienced before in an MCU show. And all of a sudden, I did a full 180. Not a full 180, like I said, but maybe a 100-degree turn on this premise. Because if each episode can be somewhat self-contained, but can be different, can be entertaining, can have the horror, and can bring something different to the MCU, then is this going to be my favorite MCU show of all time? Is this going to be in the top 10, top 15? No, absolutely not. But is it going to be well worth a watch, and it's going to be something that brings something of value to the MCU? Absolutely, it is. So as the horror continued to progress and as things began to unfold, I really completely switched my mind, changed my mind on the premise. Now we can go back on this next week, and next week's episode could be just so boring and so bland and just total filler as another trial happens. It's totally possible, right? And that's sort of the danger of serialized television, is that each episode could just be so different and varying in quality just based on the storyline that they write up. Because I think this episode happened to be entertaining enough where it worked, but who knows what'll happen next week. But this episode, I think what I was saying earlier about the house being so idyllic, right, and so perfect, is that it was such a juxtaposition to what happens later when the house starts to devolve into this madness, into this chaos. And I think it worked incredibly, incredibly well. Also at the end, I like how, by the way, Agatha's trauma and hallucinations are coming out a little bit later than everyone else, because she lied about drinking the wine and she drank it later, and now everything's kind of happening in staggered format. That just attention to detail that works really well. She has some real trauma with her son. Whether or not Teen is her son or not, I don't know. But there's going to be a lot more that's explored there, and I'm sure we'll get a sort of WandaVision episode 8 kind of flashback scene where we see exactly what's going on here. But yeah, I think by the time they get out of the, which by the way, for what I was saying, even though I enjoyed the episode as a whole, and I think that it did a lot of really interesting and new things for the MCU, which I liked a lot. I did think it was a bit corny when they all had, one by one, they all had to come down out of that slide, and it looked kind of fake and cheap, and they were all screaming, and they panned on every single character. That wasn't great. But then the episode ends on a note that I, again, wasn't expecting at all, and Sharon Davis dies. And while it ends on a joke, right, where Agatha, which this joke was set up, by the way, this joke has been set up for the whole series, so it wasn't like one of those MCU quips that they were just trying to quip for the sake of quipping. It was a joke that had payoff, and I thought it was amusing, for sure, definitely funny. But I think that joke also was clever in that it didn't diminish from the shock. I wasn't expecting it. I thought, oh, they're gonna revive her and they're gonna move. No, she's dead. I think. Maybe she's not dead. Maybe she gets possessed next episode. I don't know. But it seems like she's very much dead. Sharon Davis. And I think that's definitely something new. I think that this show is willing to take some risks here. And look, did all of it pay off? No, I think some of the scenes in the house were pretty corny and pretty lame, honestly. But overall, I saw the vision here. No pun intended, I didn't actually see vision here. But I saw the vision, the juxtaposition between the idyllic house and the bickering and sort of, oh, this is fine, and just solve some riddles while Agatha is trying to scheme. And then all of a sudden it just turns into your worst nightmare. And I don't know how much of this I could take if every single episode just follows this formula. I'm hoping they switch it up and do some new interesting things with the horror genre. But if they have a handle on how this could be a different kind of MCU show, I'm on board. Honestly, I'm on board. I think that this is one exception where I go, other than sitcoms, right? Where I'm like, no, you can make self-contained episodes. I think the premise will get a little bit old and tired the more that we go. It's like, okay, we're on trial number 5 and we've done the same thing over and over, just in a different setting. I think that'll get a little bit old, but for the time being, I think I'm on board. I couldn't believe I was saying this by the end of the episode, because I was the one who was saying, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself if every episode is a different trial from the Witch's Road. But if every episode is as entertaining as this for the most part, I think I'm on board, guys. This isn't, again, certainly as a whole, Agatha All Along is not even close to my favorite MCU anything. But I think if we maintain this level of entertaining and this kind of horror vibe, I think it's definitely going to be on the good side of the MCU shows for sure. And I'm looking forward to seeing next episode. I really am, because it's entertaining. It really is. So what did you guys think of Agatha All Along episode 3? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Did you enjoy the premise? What did you think of all the hijinks that ensued in the horror aspects? Maybe I'm just a wimp and maybe this is lame horror for you guys. I don't know. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought about Agatha All Along episode 3.